We are very pleased to welcome our next speaker, Kenna Pitts, an organizational change management consultant and enterprise risk governance analyst. An accomplished executive, she has 2 decades of experience within the banking and financial services industry in risk management and compliance, as well as corporate communications, media, and public relations. In her opinion, the coronavirus pandemic and increasing global urgency around climate change and social justice are placing even more pressure on organizations to prioritize their ESG risk management practices. Stakeholders understand frameworks and programs for addressing environmental, social, and governance issues are critical to a business's reputation and financial performance.
Good afternoon, everyone. The world is changing, and with these changes come challenges that can obstruct the way organizations do business and achieve their goals. Management teams are looking beyond financial growth and embracing the growing importance of environmental, social, and governance metrics that impact corporate value and reputation over the long term. Additionally, the need to disclose ESG performance is accelerating, enabling financial institutions and insurers to evaluate companies' ESG performance, pushing investment towards sustainability-focused companies. The right strategy and execution will be vital to meeting the ESG demands of your organization. Greetings again. My name is Kenna Pitts, and I'm your speaker for this topic. I am the founder and CEO of Leader International and Kenna Pitts Consulting. I'm an organizational change consultant, and I work with organizations to help them identify and resolve organizational misalignment specific to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, corporate social responsibility, and leadership development. I am both honored and excited to present to you all today. In our time together, we will explore the facets and significance of ESG, as well as what's happening today across the spectrum, what challenges exist in this environment, and what we should have on our radar moving forward. So what is ESG? Most of us have a good understanding of ESG, and I think it's important to include and define a few terms to help us frame our topic today. People often become confused over the differences among responsible investing concepts like ESG, CSR, and SRI. While all of the concepts are related, each has its own definitive goals and characteristics. ESG, environmental, social, and governance, refers to the ways in which corporations consider these dimensions in their operations and codifies what the company discloses or reports. 2 major alternative terms for similar approaches are for corporate actions, CSR, corporate social responsibility, which explains how the company behaves, and for investing, SRI, an acronym used in several phrases such as socially responsible investing or sustainable and responsible investing. Each of these terms categorize how investors analyze companies according to their CSR practices and ESG disclosures. The major goals of most of these investing approaches are to do well while doing good. That is, investors want to receive both a financial return and a positive social outcome, a social return. The characteristics of the investing approaches can vary quite a bit from negative screening approaches to positive tilt approaches. Many ESG investing approaches tend to have a positive screening approach in which the investor will tilt their portfolio towards firms that have higher ESG ratings, with lower or no portfolio weights on firms that have low ESG ratings. A number of third parties such as Morningstar, Bloomberg, Thomson International are providing ESG ratings for corporations and for mutual funds. Morningstar reported in 2018 that investors are avoiding traditional mutual funds that have low ESG scores. The interest in ESG investing has grown so high that corporations are even hiring ESG specialists to help them in talking to their investors and to the rating firms. So why is ESG important? ESG is a generic term used in capital markets used by investors, referring to 3 key factors when measuring sustainability and ethical impact to evaluate corporate behavior and to determine the future financial performance of companies. ESG stands for, of course, environmental, social, and governance, and refers to those 3 key factors. Environmental factors, in essence, revolve around reducing pressure on the environment and include a company's efforts put into the circular economy, climate change, decarbonization, energy efficiency, reduction of plastic waste, resource depletion, among other areas. Social factors are about people and relationships and includes things such as customer satisfaction, data privacy, diversity, fair trade, employee engagement, inclusion, social justice, human rights, child labor, product safety, and again, many other areas. Although the social element may be difficult to define and quantify, it can make a big difference, especially in terms of trust, engagement, and reputation. Governance involves practices that are used to run an organization or network. The nature of governance is also changing, with expectations gravitating towards more decentralized and flexible structures than before. This is driven by accountability, diversity, open dialogue, fair treatment, transparency, and other factors. The current pandemic, as well as recent social justice movements, have materially impacted corporate governance trends and put pressure on boards and management oversight of corporate culture, people management, diversity, equity, inclusion efforts, and other issues. The governance criteria also focuses on accounting, reporting, and tax strategy, board diversity and composition, bribery and corruption, executive compensation, supply chain management, shareholder rights, and political donations and lobbying have come to be an issue lately. ESG factors are increasingly being considered by investors as part of their investment analysis and decision-making process. According to the GSIA Global Sustainable Investment Review Report of 2020, the most common sustainable investment strategy globally is ESG integration, meaning a systematic and explicit inclusion by investment managers of environmental, social, and governance factors into financial analysis. Organizations that have invested in ESG integration have already realized improved financial performance and created ESG programs and procedures to support sustainable growth. According to recent studies released by the Bank of America Securities, the impacts of incorporating ESG into business principles and objectives are overwhelmingly clear. Top-ranked ESG-ranked companies recorded better performance than the average S&P 500 company. New investments in ESG funds could total an estimated 20 trillion US dollars in the next 2 decades, with women, high net worth individuals, and millennials taking the lead. Companies focused on employee engagement outperformed their peers by over 40%. And 90% of bankruptcies of S&P 500 companies between 2005 and 2015 could have been avoided if they had screened out firms with below average environmental and social rankings just 5 years earlier. So, current trends in the environmental space. Experts knew the sustainability landscape was quickly evolving, and this is nowhere more apparent than in all the new trends we are seeing for 2021 headed into 2022. Thanks to Generation Z, sustainable products are one of the top sustainability trends. Expect sustainable products to become mandatory among consumers in the coming months and years. More than any other generation, Gen Z is aware of climate change, loss of biodiversity, and the responsibility to try and fix these things. Research suggests that 54% of these young adults think a company's environmental and social efforts are very or extremely important when considering whether to purchase a service or product. And of course, Gen Z is gaining more purchasing power as they join the workforce. Fossil fuels used to be cheaper than renewable energy, but that is quickly changing. Wind and solar plants have become between 70 and 89% cheaper in the last 10 years, and their capacity will exceed coal and gas in less than 5 years, according to the IEA's Renewables 2020 report. In fact, solar power is now cheaper than coal. Renewable energy will continue to get cheaper because renewable technology costs follow a learning curve. They get cheaper as we increase capacity. Thus, when countries like the United States deploy renewables, they lower the cost for everyone, make the technology accessible for the entire world. The work from home lifestyle is one of the more unconventional sustainability trends, but it's surprisingly effective. Work from home, of course, took off as a necessity in response to COVID-19 for many corporations, but it turns out that working remotely is also very good for the environment. When we work from home, we reduce the number of cars on the road and energy used by office buildings, thus reducing overall greenhouse gas emissions and fossil fuel consumption. Major companies like Twitter, Shopify, and other tech companies have already committed to their staff working from home full time, even when the pandemic ends. This means widespread benefits to the environment, generally from less consumption. In the words of Kate Lister, the president of Global Workplace Analytics, there is no easier, quicker, and cheaper way to reduce your carbon footprint than by reducing commuter travel. Carbon offsetting means making up for the emission of CO2 and other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. A carbon offset occurs when a company or organization funds carbon offset projects that remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere or prevents some greenhouse gases from being released. Carbon offsetting can be as simple as planting trees or more complicated, such as investing in carbon capture technology. Carbon offsetting is already common in sustainability circles, but with the rise in popularity of net zero emissions, we expect that 2021 will see some carbon offsetting go mainstream in public later in this year. Current trends in the social space. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is our number one trend for the US this year and continues to be a hot topic in other regions such as the UK and Canada, and perhaps maybe on the rise in the EU as well. The murder of George Floyd in the United States and the subsequent protests resulted in a collective awakening in countries around the world, causing social and racial justice issues to gain unprecedented attention. There is an increase in demand for racial and ethnic diversity at the board, C-suite, employee levels, as well as increased investor demands for disclosure of key data on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Gender diversity also remains a priority in this space. Anti-racism and anti-discrimination policies are being prioritized and positioned in new ways in organizations that were previously left up to HR departments and outside consulting firms. Now, taking stances on the latest social movements has become common practice for organizations of all sizes to make their voices and their opinions heard. Organizations are facing increasing pressure from the public to address what's going on in the news and to make changes internally as a result. In the US, philanthropic institutions provide vital support for organizations that serve the public interest. Yet, foundations possess an ambiguous identity that is neither completely public nor completely private, and which operates at the intersection between government and the private sector. These foundations fund services that benefit society and thus enjoy a tax exempt status as nonprofit entities. This dual nature for years has spurred debate over the public versus private nature of a foundation's tax exempt assets, such as whether the foundations have a responsibility to redress institutional or social inequities, or if they should be required to release internal documents for public scrutiny. Over the past 5 years, corporations' commentary on data privacy has increased by almost 1,000%. This area of ESG includes corporations being held accountable for how they handle sensitive customer data, specifically around their data privacy and protection policies. Cyber risk and ransomware attacks are on the rise, as is indirect funding of organized crime. This is facilitated by insurance companies who have to process claims to those who paid ransoms to regain access to data and systems after hacking attacks. Current trends in governance. One of the most important trends in the ESG space, as we just talked about, is an organization's diversity on its executive teams and their corporate hierarchy. What was once an opaque process for deciding who gets promoted and elevated to executive positions now has a push for more transparency and accountability by every level of the company. Investors are measuring the success of companies not just on the dollars and cents, but who is running them and what their diversity makeup is. Climate change is a dominant theme as governments across the globe introduce more climate-related regulations. As a result, what we're seeing in commitments are net zero emissions by companies and investors to become standard practice by the end of the decade. Many firms will look into seizing new business opportunities and position themselves as climate leaders. At the same time, investors are increasing engagements around climate change and will likely begin to incorporate climate risk into their voting policies. Since Citizens United versus FEC paved the way for money and resources to be given toward political initiatives, a greater call for transparency and accountability in lobbying and advocacy has been ongoing, and even more so after the January 6th attacks on the United States Capitol. Organizations are being asked by their employees and investors to address where their lobbying efforts are and where their political action committee money is going, and more importantly, why. Disclosures on ESG factors will become standardized and widespread by the end of the decade. As with corporate governance reform, intensified pressure from investors will serve as a major catalyst for change. Regulations will also play a critical role, with comply or explain codes of best practices potentially addressing E&S issues. Early signs of regulatory initiatives on corporate disclosures are already revealing themselves in some jurisdictions and may become more widespread. As noted earlier, corporate governance codes, executive compensation disclosures, say on pay, and board gender diversity mandates spread rapidly across the globe during the past decade as different jurisdictions learned about implementing governance standards from each other. Existing reporting standards may serve as the blueprint for any mandated reporting, including reporting standards intended for the investment community, such as the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board and the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Reporting frameworks addressing broader stakeholder audiences, such as the Global Reporting Initiative, also provide a clear roadmap. Verification and assurance will play an ever-increasing role in confirming the accuracy of these disclosures. So, what's with all the urgency? This is not a new concept. ESG has been around for decades, but what we're seeing now is increased interest from the regulators. U.S. regulators have issued a highlight in observations, including deficiencies and internal control weaknesses from recent examinations. The SEC states that rapid growth in investor demand, increasing numbers in ESG products and services, and the lack of standardized and precise ESG definitions present certain compliance risks. The SEC's examination priorities for 2020 and 2021 included a focus on ESG investing. Examinations of the firms engaged in ESG investing focused on three broad elements. First one, portfolio management, and this includes policies, procedures, practices related to ESG, and the use of ESG-related terminology. Performance advertising and marketing materials. That included a review of regulatory findings, websites, responses to due diligence questionnaires, requests for proposals, and client investor-facing materials. Compliance programs included a written review of their policies, procedures, their implementation, compliance oversight, and ESG investing practices and disclosures. So the hallmark of a sustainable finance is the integration of ESG factors in the DNA of a financial institution, from strategy to investment and credit decisions to risk management, all the way to external reporting. The number of financial institutions that integrate ESG in their decision-making processes is on the rise globally, and it's expected to increase in a post-COVID economy, as studies have shown that companies with high ESG ratings have held up better than their competitors during this crisis. But this does not come without challenges, of course. 6 key challenges, if properly tackled, move financial institutions toward not only compliance to ESG regulation, but also to long-term value creation. The first challenge is striking the right balance, anticipating adequately to relevant risk, A good practice here is seeing past the ESG label and getting to the issues. The hard work of breaking down E, S, and G for a specific company or investor is the starting point to any successful ESG approach. For example, in the case of the bank as an employer, non-discrimination and privacy can play a large role. When looking at the bank as an investor, it's important to assess the sector and geographic exposure of the bank's portfolio. Issues such as land rights, impacts on indigenous people, or human rights defenders in a specific market might be more prominent than standard labor issues. Having a clear understanding of the specific issues that are material will help financial institutions focus their time, energy, and resources on fewer yet more impactful issues. The second challenge is translating the ESG strategy into the organization's ecosystem. A good practice here is integrating ESG in the credit or investment cycle. Once an investor has understood which ESG issues to focus on, the questions of how and where to address them still remain. When investors, be it banks or asset managers or development finance institutions, plan on moving ESG from policy to practice, it's useful to embed ESG in existing processes rather than creating parallel checks. The credit or investment cycle is the formal flow of decisions playing a central role in how funds or assets are managed, and these processes are therefore the natural framework for ESG integration. Investors should incorporate ESG factors throughout their credit or investment cycle, from loan origination to completion or renewal. By incorporating ESG factors in credit worthiness assessments, for example, investors can anticipate ESG risk well before investing. The third challenge is adapting stakeholder management and spreading ESG knowledge in-house. Good practice here is training investment firms on effective ESG engagement with a diversity of companies. Many investors have the chance to directly engage with the companies in their portfolio. The due diligence phase, the post-investment phase, and the reporting check-ins all represent opportunities for the investor to collect and analyze ESG information about a company. Making sure that those chances are used in the best possible way to manage ESG risk is essential. The skills of the people in the process are the real key to your success. Therefore, the investors should ensure that investment managers and teams can access training on how to effectively engage corporations on ESG. Fourth challenge is collecting, managing, and using ESG data for risk modeling. Good practice here is using your existing CDD KYC practices for ESG data collection. Data collection is essential for investors to successfully identify and assess ESG risk and integrate ESG into risk modeling. Information on the client's supply chain structure, including exposure to geographies with higher human rights risk or poor governance, can give investors a picture of their exposure to social and governance risk. Where possible, investors can use their existing client due diligence, know your customer, to collect and process the data. Integration in ESG and into KYC would also remove the need to design and implement a new channel or system for client outreach, and that'll help you avoid generating reporting fatigue on the client side. Fifth challenge is delivering and communicating on ESG commitments. Every financial institution may at some point need to show why and how they have taken care of their ESG risk and if they manage to harness ESG opportunities. For example, a private equity firm may seek to successfully exit a company with strong ESG credentials. This needs to be clearly visible, quantifiable, shareable with the broader audiences. A clear baseline showing the ESG status of the company at the time of acquisition, accompanied by the roadmap of ESG actions undertaken during the holding period, and the outcome of these actions would help buyers grasp the added value of ESG alongside the financial validation and valuation information. Last challenge is embedding ESG into existing risk practices. Financial institutions can make themselves future-proof by integrating ESG risk in every stage of the risk management framework. This ensures that ESG risks are holistically integrated into existing practices. For instance, under risk monitoring, Financial institutions should frequently engage with sustainability experts to stay informed on policy developments. For ESG risk identification, investors should consider whether their investments are concentrated in specific industries or regions. Climate stress testing can be used for ESG risk assessment as well. And finally, ESG risk can be mitigated by means of exclusion policies or adapted risk premiums. So, what's next on the horizon of ESG and sustainability? In the past, sustainability and social responsibility as compliance matters fell into the category of soft law, but this is definitely changing. With the Global Magnitsky Act, the U.S. added certain human rights violations as subjects of its already robust sanctions program. In the UK, the first individuals targeted under the new post Brexit sanction program was human rights violators. New legislation concerning forced labor in supply chains is under consideration in Washington, and the EU is set to require larger companies to conduct due diligence on human rights and environmental issues along their value chains, as well as requiring large corporations to publish sustainability reports. Human led EDD has long been the standard for vetting third parties or other businesses that present elevated FCPA or similar risk. But it's inherently agile, and with the right due diligence team, many of the research and investigative methodologies used to focus on anti bribery or sanctions compliance can readily be adapted to focus on other issues in response to changing client concerns. Again, the mechanics of that should feel familiar. In-house risk or compliance committees have existed for years, and grappling with SOX or FCPA or cybersecurity or whatever else may come along. Many of the people who serve on those committees would be the same ones serving on an ESG committee, or even better, the risk committee expands its duties to include ESG as well. Compliance, risk, and audit teams need to think about how to address these priorities. The urgency is growing, and some of the frameworks and tools are indeed new. However, the fundamental process is not. Regardless of the industry, elevating an organization's ESG performance is not just the moral thing to do, it creates real value and opportunities for companies, including their shareholders, stakeholders, and employees. As ESG involves fundamental choices at both strategic and operational levels, it must be embedded into the organizational culture as the modus operandi of a company. Having good intentions will not be enough. And going forward, regulators, investors, stakeholders, all of them will be looking at whether a company has a strategic and coherent ESG vision, as well as the capability and processes put in place to deliver on it. Today, there is no standard approach to measure or report ESG data. However, there are ways of doing that. And I do believe going forward, companies worldwide will be required to more seriously measure and report the outcomes of their ESG initiatives. Proactively acting on ESG has become increasingly pressing at a time of heightened attention with regard to the impact of corporations on the environment and people, and with investors and executives realizing that a strong ESG proposition can create higher value and more opportunities. This concludes my presentation. Thank you all for your time today.